Good evening, Castlers. LFO7 here again to bring you Let's Castle action. But before I do, don't forget to hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe. Also, be sure to click the bell icon, which will notify you when the latest Let's Castle video will be available. With the Independence Day tournament quickly approaching, I wanted to go over some matchups that may take place in the tournament. So far, there are 23 players competing. There is still one spot available in the tournament as the max amount of players is set for 24. There will be two groups of 12 players competing. Each player within that group will play each other twice, once as black and once as white. The player with the most points accumulated would advance from their group to meet in the finals. This evening I wanted to highlight Warpathhunter and Ydtd. These two were very cordial when I conducted my dual interview with them, which was surprising because both are tremendous competitors and have been vociferous in their insults at one another prior to the interview. Looking at their career record against one another in daily time control, Ydtd actually has a losing record against Warpathhunter. Not many people in the club can boast of a winning record against the baddest man in the club, Ydtd, but Warpathhunter can, as he is 1-0-1 against him, meaning Warpathhunter has one win, no losses, and one draw in 2 career games. We will be looking at both games. The first game was completed on New Year's Day of this year. It took place in the Happy New Year tournament. Warpathhunter boasted that he didn't care what he did against the rest of the players in the tournament, but that he was going to focus all of his energy on defeating Ydtd. Warpathhunter had white and Ydtd had black. Let's see what happened in this game. Warpathhunter started out with his favorite opening and what his moniker stands for, pawn to b4, aka the orangutan opening. This opening is usually played to surprise the opponent rather than playing a strong move. Ydtd continues with pawn to e5, grabbing the center. Ydtd said before playing Warpathhunter in this tournament, if he plays that bull jive orangutan opening on me, it will be like me having the white pieces instead of black pieces. And ladies and gentlemen, he did not use the word bull jive. I cleaned it up. But in other words, he's saying he will have the slight advantage with the black pieces rather than vice versa, because the fact that white moves first, it takes control of the center first. But since white moves a wing pawn in the orangutan opening, black has the opportunity to grab the center first. And you want to grab control of the center because most of the action is going to take place in the center of the board. But let's continue. Warpath played pawn to a3, knight to e7, bishop b2 attacking the e5 pawn. Knight g6 defends it, pawn to d4 puts 2 attackers on the e5 pawn, that b2 bishop, and also the d4 pawn. TD takes the attacking pawn. Warpath recaptures with his queen. Knight to c6 hits the queen. Queen to e4 check. Warpath checks the king while eluding the attack. TD blocks with his queen. Then you get takes, equal trade of queens. You then get pawn to e3, pawn to d5, knight to e2, bishop to d7, pawn to h4. Warpathhunter starting a kingside attack. Pawn to h5. TD quickly thwarts the attempt. Pawn to g3, knight to f5. Bishop to g2 threatens the unguarded d5 pawn. Pawn to c6 defends it. Knight b to c3. Warpath developing his queenside knight. Ydtd castles queenside. Pawn to e4 threatens the f5 knight. D takes e4, knight takes e4, an equal trade of pawns. Pawn to f6. Warpath then decides to castle queenside. Ydtd develops his bishop in order to connect his rooks and help them coordinate together for a future attack. But then Warpathhunter plays the great move of rook takes d7, snagging the bishop and sacking his rook. TD recaptures with his rook going up in the exchange, taking a 2-point material lead. But Warpath has a plan cooking as he plays bishop h3, skewering Ydtd's knight. Ydtd plays the best move, knight h6. Even if Ydtd wanted to be stubborn and protect the knight, and plays, let's say he plays rook to d5. Then knight c3 threatens the rook again. Let's say Ydtd still wants to be stubborn and protect his f5 knight and play rook to e5. Well, then that just means pawn to f4 is coming, and you're going to end up losing the rook as all squares are covered. So Ydtd, being the skilled chess player that he is, calculated all of these possibilities and played the absolute best move of knight to h6, like so, and giving up his rook. Bishop takes d7 played by Warpathhunter accomplishes this. TD recaptures, and we were now back to an even game. Excellent use of tactics by Warpathhunter, and it was at this moment that Ydtd knew he was in for a tough game, and that the man known as the orangutan was no pushover. Rook to d1 check was played by Warpath. Ydtd runs his king away with king c7. You then get knight d4, rook g8, bishop c3, pawn to a6. Warpath checks the king with his knight. Ydtd eludes the attack with king c8. Pawn to a4, knight f8, knight f4. Warpath attacking TD's unguarded h-pawn. TD responds with pawn to f5, attacking the orangutan's more valuable e4 knight. Knight g5 brings it to safety. Pawn to g6, rook to e1. Warpathhunter, aka the orangutan, threatens the unguarded bishop on e7. With this move, and Warpath is constantly attacking Ydtd and has him on his heels a lot in this game. The only other person I've seen do this consistently is checkmate in 4-2-7. You don't see Ydtd on his heels very often. Play continues with bishop takes g5 from TD. He takes a knight. Warpath recaptures with his pawn and simultaneously threatens the knight on h6. Knight to f7 now threatens the g5 pawn. Warpath ignores the threat and checks the king with rook e8 check. Whenever the king is threatened, you must address the threat. That threat takes precedent over any other threat in the game. So great move from the orangutan. Ydtd saunters his king over to d7, attacking the rook. Rook to b8 eludes the attack and threatens the b7 pawn. Again, Warpath steadily on the attack. I am impressed. King c7. TD wants to threaten the rook and guard his pawn. But then Warpath plays the absolutely brilliant move of rook takes f8. Ydtd can't ignore the threat because he will lose his rook and most likely the game. But if he captures the rook, like so, it's similar to swallowing a poison pill because knight to e6 check is coming, forking his king and rook, and you lose the rook that way also. Again, Ydtd played the best move. Rook takes f8. He has to take it. He's got to take it. But here comes knight e6 check, like I alluded to. The knight attacks the rook and king simultaneously. King d6. Knight takes f8, gobbling up the rook, and Warpath now had a 3-point material lead on Ydtd. Just an outstanding display of a decoy tactic utilized by the orangutan. Could Warpath fulfill the prophecy and upset Ydtd? Knight takes g5 snags a free pawn for TD. But knight takes g6 did the same for Warpath. Knight to e4. TD going after the unguarded f2 pawn. Warpath defends it with bishop to e1. Knight to f6. Knight h4. Warpath hits the unguarded f5 pawn. King to e5 defends it. Bishop c3 check from Warpath. King e6. Bishop takes f6. Warpath says, thank you for your knight. I'll just trade away equal pieces because I'm winning in material, and I'll promote my pawns to a queen. King takes f6, TD recaptures. King to d2, king g5, knight to f3 check, king f6, king e3, king to e6, knight d4 check, king e5, pawn to f4 check, king to d5, knight takes f5, Warpath takes a free pawn, and he now has a 4-point material lead. Warpath can see the finish line right now, and he has a big Kool-Aid smile on his face. King c4, Ydtd not giving up as he attacks the unguarded e4 pawn. Pawn to c3, defends it. King takes c3, snags the hanging pawn. Pawn to b5, c takes b5, and then a5. Ydtd has cut the deficit down to 2 material points. King b4, TD goes after the isolated a pawn. Knight to d6, Warpath hits the b7 pawn. King takes a5, Ydtd has cut the deficit now to 1 material point. But the orangutan counters by pushing his pawn to f5, 3 squares away from promoting his pawn to a queen. TD's king is too far away to catch it. Let's see what happens. King b6, pawn to f6, king to c7, knight to e4, king to d8, king to d4, pawn to b6, king e5. Warpath gets close to his pawn so it can aid in promotion. I call it escorting your date to the dance. King to d7, knight c3, pawn to b4, kicking the knight away to d5. Pawn to b3 on the surface looks like a good move. White's king is too far away to catch it. But Warpathhunter plays knight takes b6 check. TD moves his king to e8, but this move seals his fate because that's a forced checkmate in 10 moves with the line king to e6, king to d8, pawn to f7, king c7, knight to d5 with the check, king c6, f8 equals queen. You get your queen, it's promoted. Pawn to a5. Queen e8 check. King c5. Queen a4. Pawn to b2. 1 move away from promotion for black. Queen takes a5 check. Queen takes a5 check. There we go. Queen takes a5 check. King c4. Queen c3 check. King to b5. Queen b4 check. King a6. And queen to b6 checkmate. That's your forced 10 moves checkmate. Let's see what actually was played. King to e6 from Warpath. Then you get king to d8. Pawn to f7. Pawn to b2. f8 equals queen with the check. Promotes and checks the king. King c7 is forced. Queen to d6 check. King b7 is forced. Queen to d5 check. King takes b6. TD snags the knight and makes like John McClane. He dies hard. Queen d4 check attacks the king and that potential promoting pawn on b2. King a5. Queen takes b2, snatches away any hope for a comeback for Ydtd. And it was in this position, move 63 in fact, that Ydtd waved the proverbial white flag and capitulated. Warpathhunter played the game of his life and fulfilled the prophecy in game 1. But there was still one more game to play between these two. I'll have that game for you in the next video. I'm Ydtd07 saying stay tuned, and I'll see you soon.